Here are your prescribed doses of fentanyl, methamphetamine, and ketamine.
Thanks, but I only sprained my wrist. Is all of this necessary?
Of course, my sponsor company told me it will make all your pain go away.
Great, this is awesome.
You are under arrest for violating the Anti-Kickback Act, for healthcare fraud, and for drug trafficking.
Hi, I'm an undercover FBI agent, and welcome to our project, the opioid crisis.
Opioid use has been plaguing society for thousands of years, but the opioid crisis itself has only developed in recent centuries. Addiction has wreaked havoc on political structures, economy, and society. While the debate over whether or not addiction is ethical is widely disputed, the exploitation of people with such addictions is not. But how did humanity get itself into this mess? Let's look at a brief history of opioid use. For simplicity's sake, I split the history of drugs and opioids into 7 categories. Beginning over 10,000 years ago in the agricultural evolution, our ancestors began to keep flocks of domesticated animals. Humans began to discover the effect that certain plants had on these animals and decided to try them out themselves. This led to human use of psychoactive substances. By 6000 BC, these plants had become staples in their respective societies. The Tarahumara Native Americans harvested the peyote cactus. The Neolithic Chinese grew hemp, and the Andes people chewed coca leaves. Each group had their own beliefs about the benefits of each plant, and they began to use them as commodities, for medicinal purposes, and for religious purposes. By 150 BC, religion had heavily influenced drug use in many of these societies, the most notable of which being in Central Asia. Priests were known to use fly agaric, a white spotted red mushroom, as a hallucinogenic, to achieve states of dissociative trance. Then, after 1000 AD, opium began to be used as a pain reliever. For example, Helen of Troy used opium to ease the pain of Greek soldiers. All throughout this time, drug use was never restricted, and many societies even encouraged it. However, in 1400 AD, recreational drug use began to occur in the form of alcohol, nicotine, and cannabis. Because of this recreational use, societies began to put restrictions on such drugs. For example, the Ottoman Empire said that they would execute any farmers who smoked marijuana. Societies even put restrictions on caffeine. So before you think about drinking that cup of coffee, don't do drugs, kids. Anyways, people began to quickly realize the addictive potential of such substances, such as opium. For example, by 1900 AD, large numbers of Chinese had become addicted to opium due to its sale by the British. The sale of opium in China was then made illegal, but people didn't stop there. They began to migrate to the US and create opium dens, where many people became addicted. It was then that big companies began to realize the profitability of such opioids. Although heroin and illicitly manufactured fentanyl account for an increasing proportion of opioid-related drug overdoses, the majority of people who have an opioid addiction started with prescribed painkillers. Today, about 33,000 people die each year from opioids, many prescribed by their doctors. This phenomenon is called the opioid crisis, and it's been a very contentious debate in recent decades. We want to find out, as a society, should opioids be illegal or not? Part of the question of whether or not opioid use is ethical is based on where the fault lies. Does the fault lie in the drug itself or the person using it? Let's figure it out.
What causes addiction? When a drug is first used, the brain releases powerful neurotransmitters that create a euphoric feeling. This is the first hook for users, who will then take more to keep getting the high. Because the neurotransmitters are artificially inflated, the brain then dials back the emission of neurotransmitters. When the effects go away, a crash happens, causing withdrawal symptoms. Tolerance happens when the brain gets used to the drug's effects. Because the brain is used to it, the user cannot achieve the same high, and if they continue to try to get that high, they won't be able to, and this is when addiction happens.
Basically, this is to say that after the conscious decision is made to use a drug, the brain plays a large role in carrying out the rest of the addiction process. This is to say that the person who is addicted has little to no fault in some circumstances. The ethical quandary then remains in the decision, which can be a decision that the person has no informed control over. Who has control then, you ask? Well, that would be the doctors and pharmacists. Let's take a look. Prescription opioid misuse alone in the United States is $78.5 billion a year, including the costs of healthcare, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and criminal justice this involvement. In the late 1990s, pharmaceutical companies reassured the medical community that patients would not become addicted to prescription opioid pain relievers, and healthcare providers began to prescribe them at greater rates. This subsequently led to widespread diversion and misuse of these medications before it became clear that these medications could indeed be highly addictive. In the year 2000, an estimated 1.7 million people in the United States suffered from a substance abuse disorder related to prescription opioid pain relievers, and an estimated 652,000 people suffered from a heroin abuse disorder. Roughly 21 to 29% of patients prescribed opioids for chronic pain misuse them. Here are the facts. Doctors that are endorsed by pharmaceutical companies are being paid money to prescribe opioids that the company who endorsed them made. The average doctor can start by making $25,000 from opioid company endorsements. More than 2,500 doctors have received at least $500,000 from drug companies and medical device companies in the past 5 years alone. And that doesn't even include money for research or royalties for inventions. What we can see here is the promotion of unethical behavior deeply rooted in our society. While Big Pharma is one example of a powerful source of immorality, it is opposed by a powerful source of ethical behavior, the Catholic Church. So what does the Catholic Church think about all this?
In Catholicism, addiction is viewed as a direct threat to both a person's physical body and his or her spiritual pathway into the kingdom of heaven. The Catholic Church has taken a firm stance against substance abuse in all forms for centuries. However, the Church also understands that people make mistakes and knows addiction is a disease that can't simply be prayed away. If a parish member falls victim to addiction, the Catholic Church provides resources to aid the way back to sobriety, including directly providing drug and alcohol rehab. In the case of addiction, both the level and gravity of sin varies. An individual can knowingly choose to misuse addictive substances, such as opioids, thereby committing grave mortal sin. A person with an addiction has become enslaved by the harmful substance and has weakened his freedom. An addict whose freedom has been severely compromised is likely not guilty of mortal sin, but rather venial sin, or not guilty of sin at all. Additionally, the Church is opposed to any company that focuses solely on profit, rather than also focus on the needs of the people they serve. Most drug companies focus solely on the profit they can make, and therefore continue to jack up prices and sell opioids at alarming rates. The Catholic Church condemns this practice. It wants Big Pharma to think about those who have and will be affected by the opioids and think about scaling back the availability in getting these drugs. Philadelphia's ongoing struggle with opioid addiction has found an epicenter in the Kensington section of the city. Heroin hotspots, where open-air heroin sales, drug usage, and overdoses have become commonplace. Several people recently took refuge in the former Ascension of Our Lord Church building. So many addicts were in the church that it looked like they were waiting for Mass to start. There's a spiritual vacuum, a hopelessness that sets in very quickly. One local priest said, "The addiction cuts someone off from God." Opioid addiction entails a mixture of sin and sickness, requiring both a spiritual and a physical response, including 12-step programs that are faith-based, Bible study sessions and related spiritual teachings, daily prayer and reflection sessions, lectures and sermons that discuss addiction in terms of the Catholic faith, ministerial and pastoral counseling, and attendance of regular church services.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Season 2 of Pure Polls.
We wanted to ask our class if they knew anyone who's been affected by opioids or the opioid crisis.
85% said no, 15% said yes.
On that note, now we're going to look at what society thinks about this issue, and more importantly, how does this affect society?
The American society has always been intertwined with drugs. The pharmaceutical industry is the most despised industry in the country. It had a favorable rating of 27%. This is because drug prices keep on increasing, people are becoming addicts at alarming rates, and many legal suits and issues against the pharmaceutical industry. Drug abuse and addiction cost more than $740 billion each year. This money is lost in workplace productivity, healthcare expenses, and crime-related costs. Even though society has become more progressive and willing to accept drug usage, it still holds a tight stigma against drug usage and addiction. People are more likely to have negative attitudes to those suffering from drug addiction and towards policies that benefit drug users. It regards drug addiction as a moral failing. Here is what the US government has to say about drugs. Spoiler alert, they don't like them very much. Drug controls were first put into place in 1914 under the Harrison Narcotics Act. This act started a modern system of prescription and scheduling of chemical substances that still exists today. It outlawed the use of opium and cocaine for non-medical uses. Marijuana was added to the list of controlled substances in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act. The Controlled Substances Act was passed not long after. However, many critics say it is unclear and it lacks uniform application. It is the first article in legal scholarship to offer concrete and common sense solutions, including one grounded in a new proposed federal criminal statute aimed directly at the doctors who knowingly violate acceptable healthcare norms in prescribing opioids. However, it has a lot of loopholes. A newer law, the Prescription Abuse Prevention Act, has a much stronger punishment and will be voted on soon. This law charges doctors and businessmen who prescribe opioids to addicts with jail time. Additionally, if a patient dies from overdose, they can be charged with homicide. Other doctors can be charged with drug trafficking, healthcare fraud, and violating the Anti-Kickback Act. All these charges include prison time anywhere from 6 months to life. In recent years, and under the Department of Justice, federal agencies such as the FBI, ICE, DEA, CDC, NIH, and the FDA have poured billions into fighting the illegal domestic opioid distribution, importation, and exportation. And lastly, under the Racketeer, Influence, and Corrupt Organization Act, accusers could face up to 20 years to prison in life and or $250,000 in fines. That's a big deal.
In addition to enacting laws, the federal government has also held court cases against Big Pharma. Here are two big examples. Our first court case is West Virginia versus Purdue Pharma in November 5, 2004. Purdue Pharma was accused of aggressively marketing OxyContin to state residents, many of whom became addicted, concealing from prescribers the extent to which OxyContin's qualities could lead to addiction. Our second case is 26 states and Washington, D.C. versus Purdue Pharma on May 8, 2007. Purdue Pharma was accused of unlawfully marketing OxyContin for off-label uses, misbranding OxyContin as less addictive, less subject to abuse and diversion, and less likely to cause tolerance and withdrawal than other pain medications.
While society condemns greedy businessmen and doctors who hook people on opioids to make money, society has grown to develop a kinder heart towards current and past addicts. Alright guys, you already know what time it is. It's time for another peer review.
We asked our peers if they thought that doctors should receive endorsements from pharmaceutical companies.
92% said no, 8% said yes.
To provide a professional point of view, we talked to Dr. Eric Hurtado, a top surgeon at Cleveland Clinic, Florida, who works with opioids in and out of the surgery room. So, how did the opioid crisis come to be with prescribed medications?
How the opioid crisis started is pretty complex, but basically there was a large push for what's called the fifth vital sign. So vital signs include, your patient's blood pressure, their pulse, weight, height, and so forth. But one of the things that became important was the level of pain. So there was a pain scale that was developed from 0 to 10, and the idea was that you needed to have your patient's pain treated very well. So that's where the big push became, well, you need to give narcotics to your patients to help improve their pain control. So what happened was that there was this push. There was also a lot of non-scientific evidence showing that opioids actually decrease pain, because these haven't been studied very well, to be honest, despite their widespread use. So over time, as more opioids were given for different indications to help improve pain scores, many people who normally wouldn't have been exposed to these medications may have become addicted. So for example, for people who have chronic pain and use opioids, about 21 to 28% will actually abuse them, which means using the medicine incorrectly. And about 8 to 12% will actually become addicted to the medication.
How do hospitals work to prevent addicts or former addicts from getting unauthorized opioids from the hospital?
So there's several different safeguards they have in place to prevent addicts from getting access to opioid medication. So first off, the medications, when they're prescribed, are usually now sent electronically, so only the physician can send them, and it's registered with the pharmacy, so that way there's no forging of prescriptions to obtain them illegally. Additionally, the state of Florida also has what's called the Physician Drug Monitoring Program. And what this program does is when you prescribe an opioid for a patient for an indicated use, you must go to this website, which then tells you how many prescriptions this patient has had for opioids, when they were prescribed, and additionally, what their overall narcotic risk is. So this can help people from what patients call drug shopping, where they go to one physician and get an opioid prescription and then go to another physician and get the same prescription. So this greatly decreases that ability for those people to do that and abuse those medications.
What can happen to medical staff that prescribe opioids illegally?
First off, there's a couple things. So again, going back to the recent Florida laws, for patients who have acute pain, specifically after surgery, you're really only allowed to prescribe 3 days of opioid medication. You can extend it to 5 days in certain circumstances when patients have more pain. That kind of limits the ability to prescribe the medication. For people that are doing things unethically, the hospital can also review their actions, and if they find that their actions aren't falling within the standard of care, they can be warned, re-educated, or potentially lose their privileges within the hospital system. Additionally, this can also be done for the state, because every physician is licensed through the state. If a complaint is brought to the state board about that physician, they could potentially lose their license to practice medicine in that state.
Do hospitals in the US have certain policies when it comes to doctors' endorsements from pharmaceutical companies?
If a physician has a relationship with a certain drug company, which has happened in the past, specifically companies that also sell opioids, because at some point when there's a new medication, someone's going to market to physicians and also educate them. However, there's also a statement called the conflict of interest. So if you are paid by a drug company, at least within many different hospital systems, you have to state that you are in fact a paid employee of that pharmaceutical company. So that way, if you're championing a medication, this is also taken in light with the money that you may get for prescribing that medication.
Do you think even controlled opioid use is ethical?
I do believe the use of opioids can be ethical. It depends on the context of use. For example, a lot of people who have surgery, specifically open surgery, which we call laparotomies, which are bigger incisions, they can have a lot of pain. Just prescribing Tylenol, non-steroidals such as Motrin and ibuprofen may not adequately control their pain. So in cases like that, it is absolutely ethical because you don't want your patient to suffer unnecessarily. However, when you start talking about chronic pain, that becomes a very different situation. There's a lot of different types of chronic pain that really shouldn't be handled with narcotic use because they don't really cure the pain. Yes, they do numb it to some degree, but over time, as resistance builds within the body, especially to the opioid receptors, more and more opioids are required to get that pain relief. So in essence, you're actually doing more harm to your patient. That's why in these certain circumstances, usually a pain management physician who's specifically trained in chronic pain is best off handling those patients with those problems, because they can find the fine balance of non-opioid medications, such as different kind of pain modulators, and the use of opioids to find the correct balance to help those patients in their need.
In your experience, have you ever come across doctors acting unethically by prescribing opioids?
So in my experience as a physician, I personally have never had a colleague that I know of or anyone that's been affiliated with prescribing medications for their own benefit financially. However, if you look historically, especially in the state of Florida, there was a thing called drug mills. And what drug mills were back in the 90s and early 2000s were basically pain management physicians that would have patients come and then they were prescribed large amounts of opioids. And so some of the indications for receiving the opioids were kind of soft diagnoses. So basically they were receiving opioids, although legally the indications were pretty shady, and a lot of these practices were shut down and several physicians even went to jail upon an investigation by the DEA. Yes, these things unfortunately have happened in the past, but the majority of people, I do believe, are prescribing opioids ethically.
So, how has the opioid crisis really affected our society? Well, in cities and towns across the country, rates of drug overdose are skyrocketing. In the 1980s, drug overdoses increased at a slow rate, but in the 90s, it took off. This happened again in 2010 with a sudden surge in the number of overdoses related to heroin. In 2013, another surge occurred because of an increase in the use of fentanyl. Drug overdose deaths were most common in places with high unemployment, low education, and low income. Due to these factors, the crisis may be due to despair, loss of purpose, and dissolution of communities. Drugs can soothe these problems temporarily. By taking drugs, many can escape from their reality. The drug overdose epidemic is hurting all of our communities. Communities dealing with drug problems face other issues that stem from it. Communities have to spend more on prisons, the police, and courts due to drug-related crimes. Emergency room visits due to drug use also cost $37 billion each year. On top of this, 70% of abused and neglected children come from a household where a parent uses drugs. Social service programs for these families cost $23 billion each year. Additionally, as the neighborhood gets bad, people move out, dropping property values and tax revenue, which will further degrade the community. Clearly, this is a vicious cycle. Firstly, people are prescribed or buy opioids. Secondly, they become really addicted. Now this creates a lot of violence and gangs and more poverty. And these new addicts are now getting their next high. Therefore, they'll go to corrupt doctors or dealers, and the whole cycle starts all over again. So, How do we fix all of this? The best way to end the crisis and many other problems is more support and investment in lower income communities. Many of the problems that face the country, such as crime, violence, and drugs, all stem from poverty. It's hard for those in poverty to see any bright future. They only see more poverty. Therefore, they look for ways to get themselves out or just provide basic necessities, whether it be through crime or drugs. By investing in these communities to end poverty, many of these problems can be done away with. On top of this, better regulation of healthcare, doctors, prescription drugs, and more oversight are needed. As far as illegal endorsements, which is the most unethical aspect of this issue, more work needs to be done to limit access to opioids and its distributors, such as the doctors and the pharmaceutical industry. Alright, this is our final peer review. Let's go.
We wanted to ask our peers if they believed that drug addiction was unethical.
54% said yes, it is a form of body harm. 23% said no, they can't help it.
And we have some other unique responses too.
I think drug addiction starts off as experiment or relief, but eventually turns into something they can't control.
I believe selling drugs is unethical, but if someone is addicted, that doesn't make them unethical.
Drug addiction is obviously bad for you, and if you know drugs influence you to potentially harm others, you're doing an unethical thing by not seeking rehabilitation. I don't think drug addiction itself is unethical, but it's not a black and white thing either.
Catch you guys for season 3. Now, here's what we think.
I think the church has done a very good job in helping the lives of the addicts, but they should focus their efforts more on the companies that are actually producing the drugs and causing the addiction.
Our society's done a pretty good job at making people feel better about past addictions. However, we need to focus on the businesses and illegal activities from doctors.
The government and the church need to work together and dump billions of dollars into poor communities so that they can help these poor communities to fix themselves and get away from these problems.
Don't do drugs, guys.